Hello, hello. It's Eileen here, and I've got a quick update that I wanted to be sure to share with you before we dive into today's episode. The Resilience Room membership community is going to open its doors for new members Monday, July 28th through Friday, August 1st. If you've been thinking of joining us and want to be sure to be notified when we open, I want to encourage you to join the waitlist. You can do that at go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. That's go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. We only open our doors for new members a few times per year, so if you've been thinking about joining, this is a great time for you to do that. We would love nothing more than to welcome you into our amazing community. So again, you can find all the details and join the waitlist at go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. Okay, on to the episode. I remember going to the pediatrician with my daughter for her annual wellness checkups when she was much younger. And they'd always give us a sheet that lists what kids should be doing at that particular age. And none of it applied to her. None of it, right? So she was maturing and developing, but it was way off those predictable timelines that society gives us as parents as guideposts. Hi there, and welcome to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and I am a therapist, parent coach, and educator who supports parents that are raising children, teens, and young adults with brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms. If you are a parent or caregiver of a child who has intense, confusing, relentless, or sometimes even scary behaviors, you are in the right place, and I am so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Brain First Parenting Podcast, and I am your host, Eileen Devine. If you are a first-time listener here, I want to extend a very warm welcome to you. I'm so glad that our paths have crossed and that you are here. And if you've been listening to this podcast since episode 1, or for any amount of time at this point, welcome back. And thank you for coming back to listen in again. Just last week, we reached over 10,000 downloads for this podcast, which just makes me so happy. I created this podcast only a few months ago because I am so determined to get information into the ears of parents who desperately need it and the professionals who support them. So we're 13 episodes in now, over 10,000 downloads, and I'm just so glad that this information resonates with so many of you. We are just getting started, and I am really looking forward to growing this podcast and our community of listeners, all of you, for many years to come. So thanks again for being here. On this podcast, and in pretty much every conversation I have with parents or in the trainings that I facilitate for various professional organizations, we talk a lot about what our brains do for us, which sounds really simple and really basic on the surface. But if you consider yourself neurotypical, meaning your brain works as people expect it to, as society expects it to, then chances are you haven't really had to spend a whole lot of time thinking about what does your brain do for you? Because why would you? If your brain is working well, what is going to bring your attention to it, right? I can tell you that I gave my brain zero thought until I found myself parenting a child who is now a teenager, who has a brain that works very differently and often very unreliably. So that's why I always begin my conversations and trainings with the brain and making sure that we all have an appreciation for what it does for us each and every day. So this is where cognitive skills come into the conversation. And if you've listened to this podcast for any amount of time, you know we talk about lagging cognitive skills a lot. Cognitive skills are the mental processes of the brain. So it's what allows us to acquire information and learn and focus and concentrate and draw conclusions and connect dots. It's also what allows us to have meaningful and productive conversations with another person. It's what makes planning our day and organizing our tasks possible. Those are just a few cognitive skills of a very, very, very long list. It's our brain working for us all day long, every single moment of the day. So you get the picture. It's complicated. These skills that we rely on literally every moment of our day allow us to live our life with the least amount of hiccups and stress as possible. So when someone, like your child, like mine, lives with a brain-based difference, a brain that works differently, and the diagnosis does not matter, FASD, ADHD, PANS, autism, epilepsy, any of the tens of thousands of diagnoses that point back to the brain, what all of that means, those brain-based differences, it means that that individual living with that diagnosis has a brain that works differently. And what that means is that the cognitive skills that I rely on each moment of the day, that you rely on each moment of the day, they don't come as easily for those people living with brain-based differences. We assume that it does. And we're making assumptions all the time about the way their brain functions without even realizing it. So this is where things get really hard for the person living with that neurobehavioral difference. Because I say we like a larger general society, but I know as a parent, I certainly am guilty of doing this too. We make assumptions about what they can do, really what their brain can do. And usually our assumptions are way off base. So I know I'm generalizing here, and I'm lumping you into this category of neurotypical individuals who make these assumptions. And I know that's not 100% true for all of you, but I feel pretty confident in saying that for many of us, that is the case, right? So brains working differently and what it means for someone is something that I think about all the time. I'm talking about it all day. I'm teaching others about it every single day. I also have the lived experience, again, with my teenager who lives with FASD, has a brain that works really differently. And even with all of that professional and lived experience, I still catch myself making assumptions about what her brain can do. And those assumptions are typically based on what my brain can do for me, my experience of living with a brain that, again, is considered neurotypical. So I'm going to assume that I'm not alone in having these moments. And if it's something that you find yourself doing from time to time too, you are not alone. The good news is the goal here isn't to be perfect because we would all fail at that. And the good news is that perfection is not required. Thank goodness. It is not required to be the parent that our kids need us to be. So perfection is not the goal. The goal is to recognize when we are making these assumptions. And in that moment, try to take a step back and ask ourselves if this assumption is true for your unique child. Now, if you're new to thinking about your child through the Brain First lens, it may be that you don't know if you're making these assumptions or not. So that's really common when you're learning about cognitive skills, what it means for someone, in this case your child, to lag behind in specific skills. It's really hard. That learning curve can feel a little steep at first. So I wanted to give you some examples of common assumptions that our society makes about brains and how they work, and what we know based on research, are common struggles for individuals with brain-based differences. One big and common assumption that our society makes, again, based on neurotypical standards, is that at a certain age, kids can manage their frustration and disappointment appropriately. So that means something hard happens for them. And yeah, they might get upset, but they don't get so upset that they start behaving in a way that is not socially acceptable or is super disruptive or maybe even scary. We expect toddlers to throw tantrums over not getting their way, over minor frustrations. We don't expect this from a 9 or a 10 or even an 11-year-old. We know, though, that kids with brain-based differences, because of their lagging emotional regulation skills and their fragile nervous system, have a really narrow window of tolerance for everyday stressors. So those minor frustrations and disappointments are really hard for them to tolerate. This is not about their character. It's absolutely a brain thing. If you're not familiar with that concept, window of tolerance, I'm going to link to a blog post in the show notes where you can read more about that. Another assumption we assume that kids can think fast and listen fast, and we base how well they can do this on their chronological age. So as we're talking to them, we assume they're listening to what we're saying, that they're keeping up with us, that they're thinking about what it means for them all at the same time. And we know that kids with brain-based differences have very slow processing speed. So maybe hearing every third word of what we're saying because it's simply all moving too fast for them. Diane Malbin, who, if you're not familiar with her work, she's the creator of the neurobehavioral model. She always talked in her work about these kids being 10-second kids in a 1-second world. And that's no exaggeration. I know for my daughter, it's even more. It's more like 20 seconds. A 20-second child in a 1-second world. That's a really long delay. And I know this is one assumption that I can find myself making about my own daughter all the time. Rarely do we accommodate this lagging skill fully, meaning give them the amount of time they truly, truly need. Another common assumption that we, again, the big societal we, make about these kids, based on how we assume their brain works, is we assume that they can connect the dots and they can see what's coming next. So A plus B equals this terrible, awful C. And so we assume that when they can do that equation in their head before actually acting, if it's A plus B equals a terrible C, then they're like, not going to do A plus B because that's not going to work out in my favor. I don't want to have that outcome. But so many of these kids can't forward think that way. They can't connect even the most obvious dots in that way. And parents find themselves saying, what were you thinking? In what world did you actually think that that was a good idea, that that was going to work out for you, right? And the answer is they weren't thinking. They couldn't forward think. They couldn't connect the dots in the way that we assume they can. An assumption that is closely related to that one that we make about our kids and how their brains work is that we assume that kids at a certain age have impulse control. So this is such a biggie. We expect kids around the age of 5 or so to begin to be able to inhibit their impulses. So they want something that their friend has and they ask for it instead of just grabbing it, or they wait their turn, or they think of something mean to say in a moment of frustration, but they don't say it out loud because they know it's hurtful. They have this impulse to do something risky, but they can connect those dots and they have enough impulse control to think first and determine, well, that's a really terrible idea, so I'm not going to do it. Basically, they can think before they act. We know, based on research, that kids and teens and even some young adults who have brains that work differently have a really difficult time with impulse control. So they say things and they do things that they regret later when they actually have a moment to think about it. They are at high risk for getting into some pretty risky and dangerous situations because of this lagging skill, especially when there's a negative peer influence involved. And I see this play out a lot with parents of teenagers. And the parents assume that their child, their teen, has a decent amount of impulse control. But once we dig into it and ask that question, what age does that behavior remind you of, the impulsive thing they did? They realize that their 16 or 17-year-old really has the impulse control of maybe a neurotypical 4-year-old. And so then we have to talk about what that means for their parenting of their 16 or 17-year-old. It's a really hard and also really important conversation to have, and a really important assumption that we're continuously checking ourselves on. Another really big assumption that society makes about our kids is that skill growth and maturity will be fairly predictable and linear. So this is why we have so many books out there telling us about our kids and what they should be doing at certain age and what skills should be developing at certain chronological ages. Again, we know based on research that kids with brain-based differences, they're capable of skill growth and of maturing, but it happens on a very different timeline. And it's not always predictable, and it's not always linear. I remember going to the pediatrician with my daughter for her annual wellness checkups when she was much younger, and they'd always give us a sheet that lists what kids should be doing at that particular age, and none of it applied to her. None of it. Right? So she was maturing and developing, but it was way off those predictable timelines that society gives us as parents as guideposts. A related piece to this is the assumption that if they do it one day, that they can do it the next, that the development is linear. We've talked about that on this podcast before. So if you didn't listen to episode 5 about on and off days and the importance of understanding on and off days as behavioral symptoms, I would really encourage you to go listen to that episode when we're done here. It is so important. It is such a common characteristic in our kids, and it flies in the face of this assumption that their skills will be consistent from day to day. And so making that assumption, it's a really easy trap for us as parents and also teachers and providers, anyone working with these kids. It's a really easy trap for us to fall into. All right, the last example I have for you is the assumption that kids with brains that work differently can manage their own hunger and their own thirst when they are of a certain age. So they're hungry and they say, hey, mom, or hey, dad, can I get a snack? Or can you help me with a snack? Or at an older age, they feel hungry, so they go get their snack. They take care of it on their own. They can manage that biological need. We know, again, based on research, that kids with brain-based differences and fragile nervous systems don't always have reliable interoception. So interoception, if you're not familiar with that term, it's the ability to sense and interpret internal bodily signals. So they don't always experience the hunger pangs to let them know like, oh man, I need to go get something to eat. I'm starving. Or they don't feel the sensation of thirst in the way that you or I do that lets us know we need to go get something to drink. So then we wonder what's happening when behaviorally they're just really off, really having a hard time. That behavior is a reflection of them having this hunger that goes unrecognized, sometimes all day. It's having a hard day, and then we realize, oh my gosh, they haven't eaten all day. They're beyond hangry, right? So we make the assumption, and often teachers and others at school also make this assumption, that kids will take care of their hunger and they will take care of their thirst. And this is just not the case. They don't have the skills to be able to do that independently. They need prompting to eat and drink at regular intervals. So those are just a few examples of the many, many assumptions that we at times, and certainly others in our kids' life, make about them and how their brain works in comparison to what we know to be true about brains that work differently. I know that it can feel overwhelming as a parent when you're just beginning to wrap your own brain around all of this. So if that's the case for you, if you're feeling that overwhelmed, my advice to you and my encouragement to you would be to start small and begin with trying to get some space, that space that we talked about earlier, between your immediate thought or judgment that you have about your child and their behavior and what they did. And just ask yourself, is it possible? Is there a chance that you might be making an assumption here about how their brain works? What if they don't have that particular cognitive skill? What if it is a skill thing? And that's why they just did what they did. What if this is an indication that they need more support? What if this has something, if not everything, to do with their brain? And as you work to do that, just another gentle reminder that the goal is not perfection. We're going to make assumptions that later we regret or we see we're very misaligned with who our child is. It is going to happen because we're human. So perfection is not the goal. The goal, again, is for us to remain curious and always come back to the truth about the brain behavior connection and what it means for each of our unique kids. If you want to have a visual of what we've been talking about in this episode with the side-by-side comparison of assumptions we make and society makes about our kids and what we know individuals with brain-based differences struggle with based on the research, I created a free infographic that you can download to have a copy of your own. And you can find that at go.eileendevine.com/assumptions. And I'll also include the link in the show notes for this episode so you can find it easily there as well. All right. Thanks so much again for listening in. And until next time, take care. Hey, it's Eileen here, and I have a quick favor to ask of you before we say goodbye for today. There is one simple way that you can support this podcast show, and that is by hitting the follow button on the app where you're listening to the show right now. This year, my number one goal is to reach as many parents as I can who are parenting kids with brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms so that they have access to information that is absolutely essential to understanding their child and experiencing less chaos and devastation in their homes. That is why this show was created. Helping me extend my reach by hitting that follow button on this app will help me more than I can fully articulate. Thank you, and please know that I appreciate it so much.